preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening. My name is John Ruskay. As Education Director of the Y, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this, the third evening of Turning Inward, the Retribalization of the Jews, a jointly presented series of the 92nd Street Y and the Radius Institute. Again this evening, following the initial presentations and discussion on the stage, members of the audience will be able to ask questions from the microphone located in the center aisle. At the conclusion of the formal program, coffee and tea will be served at a very informal reception, which will take place in the lounge to the rear of this hall. Finally, for those of you who do not now have tickets for next week's session with Adine Steinsaltz and Stephen P. Cohen, let me inform you that there are but a handful of tickets remaining, and if you intend to and would like to attend, I urge you to buy them in the next few days. When we developed this series last spring, we sought to focus on the complex set of issues which might be considered the struggle with or seduction of particularity. For some of the issues, for us, some of the issues which are part of this subject are at the very core of our experience and what we believe some segments of American Jewry as they struggle with modernity in the latter stages of the 20th century. At our first evening with John Murray Cudahy and Irving Greenberg, we sought to analyze from different perspectives the concept of Jews as the chosen people. Last week we were privileged to have Harold Isaacs and Irving Levine explore the merits and liabilities of ethnicity in a pluralistic society. The first two evenings have started and primarily focused on the theoretical aspects of this subject. Tonight we begin with the personal odysseys of two individuals who, coming from different starting points, reflect at least some of the tensions and manifestations involved in turning inward. Our speakers this evening are Paul Cowen and Anne Roiphe. Both speakers have written major autobiographical works that have presented and shared their unique personal journeys with wide audiences. Therefore, my introductions shall be brief. Both of our participants are respected writers. Paul has authored several works, including Tribes in America, The Making of an Un-American, and most recently, An Orphan in History. A former Peace Corps volunteer, civil rights and anti-war activist, Paul is a staff writer for The Village Voice. Anne Roiphe is a graduate of Sarah Lawrence and the author of Digging Out, Up the Sandbox, and Torch Song. Various experiences, which she will discuss tonight, prompted her to write most recently Generation Without Memory, A Jewish Journey in Christian America. In addition, she is the author of several novels and scores of articles in numerous publications, including the New York Times. In a sense, the series we annually present with the Radius Institute often addresses the subject of ambivalence. The format is usually dialogues, for that enables us to present several positions on contemporary Jewish life without articulating a specific perspective. While I have my own share of ambivalences, it is particularly appropriate that this evening's moderator for this panel will be the director of the Radius Institute, Steve Shaw. Steve is a rabbi, but he is much more. Delighting in straddling dialectical positions, Steve brings together unique groups of individuals to confront or enjoy both the ambivalences and complexities of contemporary religion and culture. It is a unique talent. Therefore, it is both appropriate, given this evening's subject, and a pleasure to turn the program over to our moderator, Steve Shaw.
I think if I would ever get an award, it would be for ambivalence. I'd like to begin by telling you a story. As John has sort of blown my cover, I'm a rabbi. It's always been a great source of embarrassment to me. I've always felt that a rabbi should be much more than who I am. And I say this very realistically. The only way I get away with this is most rabbis aren't. But again, I remember once going through these pains of ambivalence and talking to one of my mentors, Rabbi Norman Frimmer, a lovely Orthodox rabbi who was then head of National Hillel in Washington. And I said, Norman, how can I, with all my problems with faith and my lack of real learning and, who I am as a human being, I'm just so ambivalent. How can I, as such an ambivalent Jew, really be a rabbi? And Norman, in his very fatherly and lovely way, put his arm around me and he said, Steve, there are thousands of ambivalent Jews out there, and they need somebody who really understands them. So that's why I'm here. But we need more than simply ambivalent rabbis, however good or bad they may be, to deal with the many dilemmas facing the Jewish people today. And in fact, before we can address all kinds of thorny issues of Jewish public policy that confront us daily, issues such as the turn inward, the whole issue of Jewish self-interest versus, if some people feel, a concern for all humanity, or those difficult issues that confront people about the stance of the current government of Israel, either in support of it or in criticism of it. Before we can address these kinds of public policy issues, we have to look more seriously at how we can begin to become authentic Jewish human beings, ambivalences and all. Ever since I first encountered traditional Jewish life in a small Hasidic village in Israel, now almost 2 decades ago, and that person who introduced me to that world, Adin Steinsaltz, will be here next week. Ever since that time, I've struggled with how to reconstruct a worldview which essentially was shattered, not only for myself, but for most of us, generations before we were ever born. And I've been moved, therefore, by the very different inner wrestlings which our 2 speakers this evening have gone through and have fortunately recorded for all of us in print. Anne Roiphe's Generation Without Memory, A Jewish Journey in Christian America, defines the core issues and dilemmas that confront many modern Jewish intellectuals in a way which I find sometimes both painfully honest, but also beautifully incisive. Paul Cowen's own journey has taken him through anti-Semitism at Choate, intellectual WASP culture at Harvard, the culture shock of a Peace Corps volunteer in South America, and the tumultuous political and social upheavals of the 60s. His most recent book, An Orphan in History, Retrieving a Jewish Legacy, recounts the circuitous process of finding his particular way home. In different ways, both Anne Roiphe and Paul Cowen have touched so many of us, as evidence the huge crowd that has attempted to get into this room, the adjoining room, and the group of people that never made it into any room this evening. And we have to talk to them too.
That's really reaching out.
So in different ways, both Paul and Anne's stories have touched so many of us by telling more eloquently than most of us ever could aspects of our very own stories. I'd like to introduce this evening's format by asking a question and giving each of our 2 dialoguees an opportunity in 10, 12 minutes or so to respond to the question, and then to pose 2 or 3 other questions, then ask Paul and Anne to question each other, and then to invite a few of you to share your questions with the panelists. First, I've asked them, and I've asked them to think about this in advance, simply to touch upon that event or events which were really the catalysts that caused them to really embark on the odysseys or journeys that have made them the personalities they are here, or at least helped them produce the books that they've both written, the last 2 books. I've also asked them to address how the inward turn, both of the Jewish community and of themselves in a way, has affected them. Have there been trade-offs in terms of their own inward journey that otherwise would not perhaps have taken place? What have been the the losses and perhaps also the gains of this very intensely personal process of turning inward toward finding their own roots and their Jewishness. What have been the rewards, as I've said, and what have been the losses? First, I'd like Anne Roiphe to address those questions.
I will in just a second. I want to take one moment to discuss the title of the whole series, which was Retribalization. The word tribe, I think Steve picked with usual ambivalence, is one that the Jewish community usually reacts to very negatively. It does not mean Africans in the bush beating drums. What it does mean is a group of people who have a coherent past, present, and future, who share symbols, who share a sense of cosmic purpose. And in that sense, the word tribe is extremely important to me, and I think a very valuable one that I don't want to lose. In talking about how I began my way back towards the Jewish tribe, I have had to use words like I and me and my family. But what I have to say will mean nothing if I am not understood as a messenger. What I have seen and felt is shared by many others. Assimilation is not an individual indiscretion, a private social error. It is a cultural phenomenon in which I have willingly participated. Now let me tell you the end before I get to the beginning. I, at this moment, would like to fold myself into the Jewish nation, its past, present, and future, as easily as I breathe, as easily as I wake in the morning, as easily as I go to sleep at night. And as you know, those aren't such very easy things to do. I want to fill myself up with Jewish content and plant myself fat and well-nourished in the center of the tribe. But my credentials are somewhat dubious. My papers, perhaps, are not fully in order. I'm still a skeptic, curious but not yet fully educated, ambivalent, non-joining. The habit of being an outsider is hard to shake. And of course, I'm a feminist, a Jew wrestling with Jewish identity. All of the above apply to me. Sometimes I am concerned with anger at a God I am consumed with anger at a God I don't believe in and won't submit to. And at other times, I'm obsessed with a desire for the sounds of Hebrew, for a ritual sharing that was never mine in childhood. I am an assimilated Jew whose family, like so many others, was caught in the fast waters of American history, where money could be made, class lines quickly jumped, and a forgetting and ignoring of the intellectual and religious past became as common as pimples on adolescents, as fleas on dogs, as mayflies in May. I am with you then tonight as a complainer. I am going to list my complaints, which occurred not in order, but repeatedly from my childhood through middle age, and some of them still go on. I complained that my American Jewish family of affluence had lost its tradition, lost its culture, and replaced them with empty values and bad dreams. I complained that the synagogue where my mother went only on high holidays and my father never, did not want me as a girl to learn Hebrew, to share in their intellectual life. That was in the 40s and 50s, but still in the 20th century. I complained that the concept of a chosen people was too heavy with bitter irony after the Holocaust. I could not bear it. I moved into universalism, but I still kept on complaining. I complained that art for art's sake, or alienation for alienation's sake, was too alienating. I entered psychoanalysis. I complained that Freud was wonderfully helpful, but that still left whole continents of the soul unshaped, unexplored, unrooted. I have complained that Abraham should never have been asked to sacrifice Isaac, that Leah should have had a husband of her own who loved her, that Lot should have kept his hands off his daughters, and so on. I have complained that the Messiah waits too long and the silence is unbearable. This report of complaints is here to establish my identity as a Jew who knows that complaining probably gets you nowhere, but it's worth a try anyhow. Now I begin my most recent struggle on the ladder of identity. Angels don't assist secular Jews on ladders. If they did, one might have been kind enough to have prevented me from writing an article in the New York Times on being Jewish and having a Christmas tree. The response, as most of you in this room know, was tremendous. Jews were irate, Christians were annoyed. Only the assimilated read the piece as if it was an unexciting recipe for apple pie. I realized as I read through the pounds of hate mail we received from Jews whose profound love of their people exceeded their tolerance for differing religious and cultural ways of being, that I would have to put aside my complaints for a while and begin to investigate what had led me to the particular pale and insipid Jewish identity I then held. Now, in my first novel, a partially autobiographical, as most first novels tend to be, I told a story about my grandfather. In this story, the grandfather was a young man. He lives in a village deep in the heart of Russia. The Cossacks are coming. The people in the village decide to build a shelter to hide the women and children and camouflage that shelter with branches, and that the men will run through the fields and disperse in various directions when the Cossacks come. The Cossacks come. The women and the children are hidden. The men run through the fields. But the grandfather character waits, and he talks to the Cossacks, and he tells them where the women and children are hidden in return for money to go to America and begin the family of the novel. This is a rather ugly story. It's totally fiction. I think now that I was looking for an original sin. I had been to Christian schools to explain the family, aunts, uncles, cousins, and their intellectual and psychological disarray. What the story was hinting at, what lay just behind my grasp, beyond my grasp, was that without the Jewish culture of the shtetl, without the ethics, the civilization of the classical rabbinate, without the poetry of the Hasid, the fervor of the Kabbalist, inventing means to enter paradise, without the rites of passage of person of season that remind the Jew of her part in the totality, in the history of the nation, its purpose in the world, without all or some of that in one's mind, the acid rains of modernism eat away at the core. If Christianity, its forms, its art, its theology, replaces Judaism, there is then a grave problem of authenticity. There must be disconnections, loose ends, a rattled brain. If no culture or civilization replaces the lost Jewish culture, then the bourgeois, surrounding herself with country clubs and objects of fashion, turns brittle and betrays the next generation, forcing them to find somewhere else to go. If the generations that follow the first immigration no longer expect Elijah to come through the door, if they no longer believe that their deeds can affect the outcome of cosmic events, if they no longer accept a Jewish purpose, if they have no Jewish memories to sustain, no intentions of giving birth to new Jewish ideas, then the result will be, as I saw it and lived it, shallow and sad. Humanism, universalism, needs a garment. It needs a specific form, a concrete method of being in the world. Bland and general, dressed only in the naked skin of all mankind, it is almost invisible. My journey brought me back to the Holocaust. At first I was transfixed. If God were God, if Jews were chosen, if. But the political events of the 20th century serve both to tear apart easy Jewish piety and to fix identity firmly in the Jewish experience. To turn away is to stand with the enemy, to deny the ones who died. It's not just, as Emil Fackenheim has said, to hand Hitler a victory. It is also to lose one's moral rage, to dehumanize or dampen one's capacity for empathy. If you don't identify as a Jew, the Holocaust becomes universal, less urgent, less real. It vaporizes into generalities. However, I was at this very Y a year ago and heard Dr. Paula Hyman talking about the meaning of the Holocaust for Jews. And she spoke of not making it the center of a new religion, of not obscuring the wealth and sustenance of the Jewish intellectual and ritual tradition in a single morbid focus. I think she caught me just in time. I was about to get excessive. The Holocaust can be a point of Jewish reentry, but it serves better at the entrance rather than the entire house. I have found such pleasure in reading Hasidic tales, in being told Jewish jokes, in listening to Jewish politics, Zionists, socialists, anarchists, the lot of them, gasping for air at the turn of the century. The lament of Jewish history is central to its potency. Temples are destroyed. The galut forms and reforms, but lament is balanced by celebration. I don't mean just redemption in Israel or the gratitude for the Torah that was given at Sinai. I mean the more prosaically, better suited for my essentially secular mind, the wonder of peoplehood, their words and stories, the Jewish content. All right, what started me on this journey was a need to enrich, to expand, to not just live in history, but to understand its effect on me, and to make for myself conscious choices to belong or not to belong. I am self-conscious here tonight, and I use the word as a pun, because I care so much about belonging. That was all written. I will go on for a moment on this question of trade-off. I think that for me, coming from an assimilated family, there is no negative trade-off. For first-generation families, if you did not move away from the tight Jewish community somewhat, if you did not seize the possibilities of education in the greater world, you gave something up. If you stayed in the shtetl, and there were shtetls in this country too, and you didn't move out, you lost economically. You lost in terms of opportunity. You may have maintained your religion, but certainly you were living in a more limited world. On the other hand, for those of us now, several generations past the great wave of immigration that came to this country around the turn of the century, for those of us, we have everything to gain and nothing to lose. No one can take away the universal education. No one can take away what you know about Dante or Keats or Auden. All we have to do is to gain. I'm finished.
Paul Cowen.
I think probably in a certain way my journey is more linear, although it involves a lot of different odd pauses. In the first place, I think I've probably always had a religious cast of mind and not a secular cast of mind. But when I was a child, I grew up in this entirely assimilated family where we had Christmas and Easter and not Hanukkah and Passover, and where I was raised by usually by Christian nursemaids. So at that time, my religion took the form of Christian prayer, and then when I went to this boarding school, Choate, there was a mandatory chapel there, and so that also took the form of Christian prayer. But there was, except for a period of what I would call sort of passive atheism when I was in my 20s and very involved in the New Left, which was a religion in itself, there was no time that I don't think there was ever a time that I didn't think of myself as a rather spiritual person. So I think in that way we probably differ in some respect. Steve asked for a point where our Jewish journeys began. And I would say that my journey began with this contradiction of living an outwardly very assimilated life and having a mother who was totally obsessed by the fact of the Holocaust, to the degree that she would, if I went into a room and my hair looked like this, she would ask that I brush it up because I looked like Hitler. We lived on Park Avenue. My father was president of CBS Television. My mother had inherited a lot of money from her father, who owned the Spiegel mail order houses. But she would tell me to learn a trade and not a profession in case the Holocaust ever came to America. And she would also urge us to work. My sister Liza's here too, so she'd urge Liza and me and my sister Holly and my brother Jeff to work in the civil rights movement or the peace movement or fight anti-Semitism wherever we saw it, all in the name of the 6 million dead. So that was a very interior Jewish reality that made me aware that I was a Jew all the time. And my father, I knew that my father had an Orthodox Jewish father named Jacob Cowen, and that when he was 21, my father had changed his name to Louis Cowen, and that my father had had a rift with his grandfather, which caused him to never see Jake Cohen again. So I was always haunted by this question of who my grandfather was. My father wouldn't talk about it. And throughout my childhood and really my until my parents died, that was one of the primary questions on my mind. I don't know how many people here haven't known a relative or adopted, but if that's the case, you're just obsessed with wanting to know more about this thing that's been forbidden to you. Also, my father's face was not only a very traditionally Jewish face, but he would take on expressions that stayed with me, that were sort of time bombs in my brain. For example, my mother could serve bacon or ham, and he wouldn't care. But if she served pork chops with the word pork in it, his face would blanch. Or when I was a kid, he would take us down to the Lower East Side, and we would buy bagels and lox and Holly. And one of my sister's names is Holly. and I would just always remember that, what we were doing. And then he'd see the Hebrew signs on the walls there, and he'd tell me that as a young man, he was pleased that he could still speak Hebrew. And I never could ask him why, how he'd learned to speak the language, but I think I must have realized there was some connection between his childhood and his ability to read Hebrew now. Finally, on Christmas Eve, he would always read us the Christmas Carol. We always had Christmas at home. And I don't know how many people here have read the Christmas Carol, but it's boring. And especially if you're eager to wrap your presents and get under the tree and get to bed and get your stocking in the morning. So my brother and Jeff and Holly and Liza and I would all leave the room by about page 6, and my father would look very hurt. And it was a family joke. It took me a long time to realize that Christmas wasn't his holiday in any way. It was a chance for him to bestow presents on us, who I think he saw as Jewish wasps. And when we left the room, it was as if this family that he was raising, but he didn't quite understand, was really turning our backs on him. I think maybe in somewhat the same way as he had turned his back on his father. So that was why the expression on his face was so pained. So I would say that my journey really started with those very early childhood experiences, and it was propelled by a lot of anti-Semitism. I won't go into the stories of anti-Semitism at the school choke, but there was a great deal. I was called a kike a lot and stuff like that. And it made me realize that there was no way that I could hide from being a Jew, that I had to find out what it was to be a Jew. Well, I went to Israel in 1961, and that was very satisfying to me. It made me feel much more comfortable and confident about myself as an American Jew and really as a member of a more extended family. But it didn't cause me to become religious in any way. I mean, I didn't think about religious Judaism. But at the same time as all this was happening, something else was happening in my life. When I was a child, my family, as I say, had a good deal of money. My parents were both monogamous and had traditional values. So we had grandparents who lived in Kenilworth, Illinois, who we visited every Christmas. So it seemed as if everything in our life was really imperishable. And then sort of suddenly, one thing after another began to perish. First, my father, who had, we'd always thought of as a child, as children, as sort of a person who would have endless successes because he'd invented the Quiz Kids, Stop the Music, $64,000 Question, and then become president of CBS Television. Suddenly, through no fault of his own, he got caught in the quiz show scandals when a show called 21 that he didn't produce, and a man named Charles Van Doren, who I don't think he even knew, and the show was on NBC, it became public knowledge that they were rigged. And it happened that 21 had an isolation booth, as my father's show, $64,000 Question, had. My father had left his production company about 5 weeks after $64,000 Question went on the air, but still he was sort of America's premier quiz master, and when he was president of CBS Television, they made him into a scapegoat and they fired him, or they caused him to resign. And I have one symbol in my memory of that resignation. Up until the time that he resigned, as Christmas approached, our front hall closet was always filled with gifts from agents or from talent scouts or from producers, from anybody who would want a little bit of his time for the next year. The year that he was forced to resign, there were no presents at all in our front hall closet. So that was just one, and before he was forced to resign, the phone rang all the time for him with big shots, and celebrities were always trooping through the house. After the newspapers and CBS turned him into a scapegoat, he was literally quite reluctant to go on the street or go to parties. People didn't come to our house very much any longer, except for very close friends. So it was one way of really understanding the perishability of the kind of material success that Anne was talking about. It just went literally overnight. And then I got very much involved in the New Left, and I don't know how many people here were committed to politics in 1964, 1965, and 1966 in the very early days of the New Left. But again, it seemed like we had an immutable community. I mean, when we sang We Shall Overcome, when we worked in Mississippi, or in any part of the civil rights movement, when we used phrases about ourselves like beloved community, it seemed as if we really had a secular creed that was both imperishable and in my case was very Jewish, because it was I just remember this anecdote when Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney were killed in Mississippi. My wife and I were in training in Oxford, Ohio. I passed a young woman who was talking on the telephone to her mother, and her mother was obviously imploring her to go home. She said if the Christians had done in Nazi Germany what we're doing in Mississippi, then your brothers would still be alive. And I realized that I wouldn't have to say that to my mother, because that was what my mother had been saying to me all my life. And she was going to work in Mississippi too. So this movement that we were part of both seemed imperishable and very much part of the tradition with which I had been raised. Then it turned out that the movement sort of fell apart, and not only for the reasons that have been written about by movement historians, not only because of the sort of ruptures between blacks and whites and men and women and gays and straights, but I think to a much greater degree because actually we based our idealism on very specific perishable goals. Voting Rights Act, integrating public places, an end to the war in Vietnam. At some point, those goals had to be achieved, and once they were achieved, we had no marks in common, we had no dogma in common, so it was almost foretold that we would go our separate ways, and we did. So it turned out that sort of secular creed was perishable. And then it also sort of gradually turned out that the America that I thought that I would grow into as a boy and as a young man, this country of limitless prosperity and limitless possibility, and a country which was really a melting pot, turned out to be quite different. It turned out to be a country which is always on the verge of a depression, where tribalism, in I think a good sense of the word, but in the sense that Anne was using, had replaced the melting pot as a dominant fact of American life, and where possibility wasn't limitless, and where my brother and my sisters and I just didn't have the same degree of financial security as my parents had had. Also, again, I'm talking about myself, but I think I'm talking about almost everybody in this country. I grew up in this very cohesive household, and now as a 42-year-old man, I have one sister who's here, but who lives in Woodstock, New York, another one in Washington, D.C., and a brother in Los Angeles. So that means that our whole family has dispersed, so that in that sense, even the family feeling we had was somewhat perishable. And finally, my parents died in a fire, and so that was a very sudden symbol of the perishability of life. And it caused me to begin to look for something, or it caused me to continue what I think was really a childhood quest for something that was imperishable. At the same time, Judaism was growing as a force in my life. One of the things that happened, I guess the most significant event that occurred, two of the most significant events that occurred. One was, as the New Left was falling apart, I really wanted something that embodied the religious sense that I had brought into the New Left. And at first I found it in the Catholic left, which I don't know how many of you remember those years, but in the late 60s they would pour blood on draft cards and get involved in acts of nonviolent resistance against the war. And they had a very cohesive, loving community. And since I had gone to this prep school, I had no trouble praying with them or taking communion with them. And in fact, the only reason that I sort of felt different from them cropped up one night during a fundraising rally when a priest began to talk about how he was working in the ghettos of Baltimore and in the peace movement because of Jesus Christ. And another person began to talk about how Jesus Christ was his problem, meaning that Jesus Christ was the reason that he fought for social change. And I realized that had nothing to do with me. And so I decided that I was going to try to recapture my Jewish identity, I thought, by writing about socialists on the Lower East Side of New York. It turned out that all the socialists had moved to Westchester County. And I got involved with very old, usually poor Jews who lived in the housing projects of the Lower East Side. And the more I came to know them, the more I came to love them. And as just a symbol, it stands out in my mind. I think probably a lot of people here who've worked for Project Ezra or DeRoad or just been in these apartments, but you know those signs from funeral homes on their walls? Every item of the funeral has been paid off. And then under that there's a sign that says, in case of death, contact so-and-so, who'd be a nephew or a niece or a son. And then you'd ask the old person, when was the last time that so-and-so visited? And they'd say not for 2 or 3 years because they're just embarrassed and scared to come down to the Lower East Side. Or people would ask me not to write about them because they didn't want their children uptown to know, to have their friends know that they had a mother or father who was still living on the Lower East Side. So it just awakened in me this real, almost racial grief for my people, which had been so divided when they came from the shtetl to America. And that had an enormous impact on me and on my father too. So he sort of began his return to Judaism. Well, I don't want to go into the whole saga that much longer, but one of the things my father wanted most for me to do was to write an article about Orthodox Jewish tradespeople. I didn't want to do it because at that time Rachel and I were still an intermarriage, and I was scared that they would reject me. But when he died, I decided to do so as a means of honoring him. And I came to know a Hasidic rabbi who lived in the intact world that you were describing in Israel and that Anne was looking for in her first book. And getting to know Rabbi Singer was probably the most important thing that happened to me. He began to call me Saul, Shaul, instead of Paul, and I liked that journey from Paul to Saul. And just one symbolic story. One day I went into his synagogue. It was a very cold day, and I was helping him clean up the floor. And this was after my parents died, and I just felt an enormous sense of peace there. And I asked him why he thought that somebody as American and assimilated as me should feel that peace. And he looked at me and he said, sometimes it happens that in the past there's a holy man or a scholar whose piety kindles a spark that smolders through the generations until it comes alive again in someone in the present. Well, I had just learned when my father and mother died that my great-great-grandfather had been a rabbi in a small town of Lithuania, and so I identified that holy person in the past with my grandfather, my great-great-grandfather, and I wanted to keep that flame alive in my own life. And since then, in ways that I'll discuss later, I've become more and more both involved with the Jewish community and more of an observant Jew. And I think it's really because it satisfies this need for religion, for an imperishable set of texts and an imperishable community, for a community that exists both in the present and exists in historic time. It satisfies all those things in me. It helps me be part of an extended family. And finally, Steve, I think for me the trade-offs are very, very minor. It may be that there's not that there would be an article that I would want to write on Saturday that I couldn't write because I don't work on Saturday. Sometimes I'd like to eat a cheeseburger. I'm really sort of trying to think of the. I was trying to think, had I lost any friends as a result of becoming a more observant Jew, and I don't think that I've lost any friends. I mean, I think at first probably there were rumors that I had become a Hasid, and people didn't quite know how to approach me. But since I wrote this book, and you see me here, I'm not a Hasid, so I'm still the same person with a slightly different way of living. So it's really been a way of supplementing my whole life in the same way that with Judaism, in the same way Rabbi Singer helped supplement my identity as Paul Cowen by teaching me who Saul Cohen was. And I think it's really brought me back home, and I just can't see, I don't have the same ambivalence that you do. I don't see this issue of trade-offs.
Who says I have any trade-offs? Or I'm ambivalent because I'm ambivalent because I can't get everything that I want. That's what I'd like to question both of you further on something which has struck me in different ways about both your books. Anne's book is a book which is, I think, incisively questioning on a theoretical level, continually asking all the hard questions, which I think any Jew who takes philosophy and theology seriously really has to ask. And many of the questions are the right ones. The answers are, let's say, ... I'm never quite sure. I mean, I don't know if I have the right answers. I have a group of stock answers. I'm pretty good by now. I've developed some stories and jokes and so forth. But basically, there are several perennial theological issues that confront Jews. Issues about God, about providence and prayer and meaning and so forth. And clearly struggles with those kinds of things. Whether she can really resolve them in, quote, an acceptable Jewish way is another issue, but she clearly struggles with them. Paul's book is much more of a book about family, his own family, finding his family. I'm just wondering, I'd like to ask both of you this question. What are what are your real belief systems, your ultimate belief systems as Jews? I sort of pointed out to Anne that I thought there were three beautiful pages where she really spelled out that belief system. It wasn't exactly Jewish, although I think it would be derivatively Jewish in a sense. It was psychoanalytic in nature. That on one level, her belief system was based on the therapeutic culture or psychoanalytic culture. But all of us, whether we want to or not, really do have a philosophy or a theology. So I'd like to ask Anne what hers is, and Paul's what yours is. Just a little question.
Can we ask you what yours is?
I'm a little stunned because I'm having trouble remembering when I knew exactly what my belief system was and how I was able to write it down. I think the central piece in my belief system is that my belief system may change, that I am not certain of many, many things. I don't easily make leaps, even when I would like sometimes to make the leap. The ritual in Jewish tradition, which is something I feel about, as probably many people in this room do, is essential to the continuing of the Jewish people, which is something I care about a great deal, becomes difficult for me because it requires words that have meanings, and sometimes I don't agree with those meanings. Now, many people who have been brought up in Orthodox or conservative homes have exactly the same kinds of ambivalences and concerns about these words that I have, but they can accept them because they were a part of their entire life, their entire memory system associated with people they love. For me, to say something I don't believe is immediately dishonest and a terrible sin in my own belief system. So I have to constantly struggle with what I call the problem of authenticity. And this is how to be as real always as possible. How not to try to fake it. Now, this is true also of the feminist bloc in my belief system, which is a very important one. It means what we've learned as feminists is that to pose, to pretend to be helpless when you're not so helpless, to in any way accept things about yourself that are not true is very dangerous. So holding to that idea, when I apply that to a Jewish identity, I try very hard not to do anything that is not absolutely authentic. Now, what is authentic changes and grows because an open belief system is always developing. The Freudian therapeutic part of it, I will just answer for a minute. It's not so much a belief system as it is a commitment not to be afraid of what's really there, which is, in a sense, why I had to write the book in the first place, because something was there. It did scare me. I was concerned about it. I knew there was trouble for me in the whole subject. Therefore, that's exactly where I should look. That's exactly where I should go. Where it's hot is where you belong. That's not a comprehensive philosophy or theology, but it's, what is it? It's the beginning rungs of a ladder.
I think I want to. I mean, I have a whole batch of things to say. One begins with something Anne says. Richard Rodriguez wrote a book with a title a little bit like Anne's. It was called Hunger for Memory. Does anybody remember that book? And I feel that hunger for memory in myself. I wish that I'd had a father who went to shul every day, so that I would have the memory of playing, or that there had been that time my mother could have gone to shul and sat in the same place. Because I would love to have the memory of playing with one of my parents Talesim or hearing Hebrew as a very little boy, so that the words that I hear in shul now, I mean, I think very much of any religion is memory and is the refraction of memory into the present. And I just haven't got it. And I'd say it's a thing, I would say that it was a thing that I missed most in life, except that a lot of people who have it seem to feel it as a terrible affliction and want to run away from it. And so so possibly there's no way of so possibly there's no way of winning, or that maybe there's no way of losing. As far as a belief in God is concerned, I actually have a very private belief in God, but I don't ever think of God as the being that created the Holocaust, or that killed my parents in a fire. And I've begun to, ever since Steve asked me this question on the phone, I've wondered whether this was a serious disjunction in my thinking. I don't know. It's just not something that's there. I mean, as I said when I was talking before, ever since I was a little boy, I've prayed to some deity, and now I go to shul for morning minyan a lot, and I find myself everybody else is reading the Amida or doing something in Hebrew. And that, as I say, doesn't echo very welcomely in my ears. So sometimes I find myself going back to those childhood prayers and praying to this very personal God. But I don't feel the kind of anger that Anne was talking about. I think that I see Hitler as the person who created the Holocaust and not God. And I see a television set as the force that created the fire that killed my parents and not God. I mean, a lot of people would find that contradictory, but it's just that is the way I feel about it. As far as ritual is concerned, I can the way that Rachel and I began to inject ritual into our lives, it occurred when our kids were very young, and it was about 1975 that open marriage was very much of a fad, and a lot of marriages just couldn't stand the burden of both feminism and the sexual revolution. So a lot of parents of our kids' friends were getting divorced, and our kids would come home and they would ask us to promise that we wouldn't get divorced. And we had already started a Jewish school for the kids, but now we began to light Friday night candles because that was like a way of symbolizing or embodying the permanence of our marriage. Well, I guess there must be a lot of people here who have begun a ritual and taken a long time to become comfortable with it. At first it seemed bizarre to put this thing on my head and say these words that I didn't know and light some candles, but so it took about 6 months just to be able to claim that one. And now it seems almost impossible not to do it. And then to take a much more complicated, doing it and then deciding not to work on Shabbat and deciding to go to shul on Shabbat was a way at least of feeling part of a community. And Steve, you talked about my interest in family and genealogy. Well, I've really come to think that for a Jew, interest in genealogy is an interest in religion, because once you find out about your father and your grandfather and your great-grandfather, your mother, your grandmother, your great-grandmother, you're really building stepping stones back to Sinai. And whether you believe that revelation occurred or not, you have to believe that the persistence of revelation is a miracle. So the closer you can get to Sinai through information, the closer you are to the existence of a miracle. And so that's why I really think that for me, both the acts of observance and feeling part of the community and the discovery of my past are both pathways to faith.
Anne, I'm wondering how you react to what Paul just said, and also if we don't define Jews often through what they believe, since it would seem that many of us would be outside the pale if we really did come out in what many of us believe, but rather through what Jews practice. Traditionally, at least, there was a halachic system, a system of ritual that governed every action almost of people's both everyday and extraordinary lives. I'm just wondering if you have developed a ritual system which you might identify as either being particularly Jewish or at least fulfilling those elements that traditional Jewish practice once, did fill.
Well, let me start with Paul's talk about going back and discovering who your family are and taking it back to Revelation. When I did Generation Without Memory, I talked to many, many people to find out what their Jewish experiences were. And almost everybody told me that somewhere a grandfather, a great-grandfather, a great-uncle was a famous, pious rabbi. And I felt terrible because the truth is, I'm sure that my people, at least as far back as we can go, were tailors or or something else. The Jewish community has always been, divided between those who were the intellectual elite and those who simply struggled along to make a living. And most of those who struggled along to make a living were women. As a result,
your theology is showing again.
I felt that what one has to do is to be able to identify with the whole of it, not particularly with the learned, but with everyone who was moving along in this tremendous parade from the beginning of time, and to find my place in it. Now, ritual is something that comes into conflict with reason. Jewish life is based on a series of restrictions. Those restrictions, in a sense, are not negative. They are for the most part, they make creative spaces between things. I see that very clearly, but at the same time, I can't say words, and most of these rituals do involve words, and I take the word very seriously. That's because I'm very Jewish. The words say certain things that I'm not sure I honestly can say. So I have trouble with that. Now, I think that where I stand is not it's not a viable position for the Jewish community. It's not a viable position for generations to come. It's just where I am now. Clearly, if everyone were like me, we'd be in very bad trouble. On the other hand, this is a process. This goes, each generation changes. It's possible for me to be the way I am because my mother was the way she was, and she was the way she was because of what happened before. So who knows what is going to seem very clear and simple to my children or my grandchildren.
Talking about children, I realize that every Jewish parent, wants just what his child, will make his child happy. But I really wonder if you don't have some expectations, and here I'd like to talk about Jewish expectations for your children, for both of you. What would you like your children to be Jewishly if you could help them become, in positive ways, those things?
Well, I would love it if we could create a life at home that was rich enough, that had enough Jewish richness, that our kids would create lives that had more Jewish richness. I would love that. And I feel very invested in it, but it also frightens me to feel very invested in it because at this 92nd Street Y, Rachel and I teach workshops with intermarried couples, and one of the things that we see all the time is a tremendous rift. I mean, one of the things that we see all the time is that the people who intermarry and sometimes the people who turn their back on Jewish life the most dramatically come from Orthodox families as well as from highly assimilated families. So I think, and their parents get so invested in how the kids come out that finally the child's behavior defines the parent's life. And I think that that's dangerous for both the parent and the child. So I don't want to get too, I would like my kids to become the way I just said, but I don't want to get too heavily invested in it because then I'm being Jewish for them, which seems to me to be dangerous for both them and for me.
Can I?
Yeah.
No, what I care about is some level of Jewish imagination in the children. That is to say that their minds are peopled with the Jewish people, with the Jewish history, with the Jewish experience. How that works itself out in terms of ritual, in terms of who they marry, in terms of what will be required of them in the world that they're going to have to live in, I certainly don't know, and I certainly wouldn't want to demand anything of them. Just to have Jewish content in their lives seems to me to be a simple and yet very complicated wish.
And I actually want to add one thing to that. I don't know whether you found this, Anne, but for me, one of the most difficult, one of the most happy, but also, I don't know whether difficult is right. One of the most time-consuming aspects of making the kind of journey that I've made has been changing the axis of my year from a secular year to a Jewish year, and the axis of my week from the one I grew up with to one where Shabbat really is the crown of the week. So that, for example, it took me a long time to cease referring to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur as the Jewish holidays and to refer to them as the holidays, which I'm sure is true of a lot of people here. Well, I would like it if somehow we would live a life that would enable our kids to see the cycle of the year as the one that we're trying to create for ourselves.
Very good. Can I ask a different kind of question? To what extent does an admittedly voluntary community, meaning the American Jewish community that all of us are part of, a community which doesn't have formal sanctions, doesn't have policemen, doesn't really have courts you can drag people to get them to do things, be they granting someone a writ of divorce, a get, or making someone observe the Sabbath or keep kosher and so forth. Our community doesn't have those formal sanctions, whereas traditional Jewish society often did. To what extent does a voluntary Jewish community have the right to impose sanctions on its members, and what might those sanctions be? Let me give you an example. I think the community really does have its informal sanctions. One might be saying, to hell with Israel. I'm going to sell information to the Arabs. I think that kind of action, even though it's not a religious action, so to speak, but in terms of the civil religion of American Jews, that is tantamount to heresy. I mean, giving up on Israel, for instance, and in fact, abetting and aiding the enemy, I would see that as, a sanction that probably most American Jews would really feel puts someone beyond the pale. In an odd way, I think the community imposed its own sense of sanctions on each of you, at least initially, several years ago. Paul violated one of those sanctions. He met a beautiful blonde woman from New England, and he fell in love with her and he married her. It didn't involve a rabbi. It wasn't a Jewish wedding. He was intermarried. They loved it. So he violated what probably still is a dominant community sanction. And Roiphe, to her surprise, also violated a sanction. I mean, it was a sanction which was expressed by tons of hate mail. She talked about very openly the fact that she celebrated in positive ways certain aspects of Christmas. So my question, long roundabout way, is really, are there any things which you have now come to believe really are sanctions for Jews, which you'd like to, if not physically impose on other people, at least make you recoil?
Do you want me to start?
Go ahead, you start.
Well, first of all, I think I was surprised that I grew up in such a strange, rarefied Jewish world, which was very assimilated and very political, that actually I didn't realize that being intermarried was even an issue for people. And I mean, that may sound strange to 90% of the people in this room, but it just didn't cross my mind. And it happened that Rachel and I got married by a minister on Rachel's uncle's farm in Massachusetts. And I never even thought to tell the minister not to say Jesus Christ in the what do you call it, the wedding ceremony. Rachel thought to do that. And then at the end we did the one Jewish thing I knew to do, which was to break a glass, and the minister said shalom, and that and that seemed to me. I mean, I didn't know about. I really did. I'm not. Now I know this stuff, but I'm not feigning in ignorance. I think there must be quite a lot of people like I was then around right now who just don't even know that these sanctions or traditions exist. The way that I found out, and actually I don't think that intermarriage played the same role in my life that your article about a Christmas tree did in yours, but the first place I found out what a problem it was came right after Rachel and I were married. I had been invited to go to Israel to be part of an American Jewish Congress Project Dialogue. Do people know about that thing? They had a conference on Jewish youth, and I was supposed to be a spokesman for radical Jewish youth. And turned out I knew a reporter for the Jerusalem Post, and Cowen wanted to interview me. She was then writing for Retribalization. And so I got a lot of ink. And one of the questions Cowen asked me was, why didn't I settle in Israel? And I said, well, I really loved Israel, but I thought I should work in the civil rights movement in America. So the headline on that article was, "The Negroes need me more than the Jews," which caused me quite a lot of trouble. And then, but also Gula and this Martha Meisel, who wrote about me in the Jerusalem Post, made a big point about Rachel's and my being an intermarriage. And a lot of people in Israel were critical of us after that. We were hitchhiking around the country. And I have to say, Steve, that criticism discouraged us from going to Israel for the next 15 years. I mean, it did not work in any way as a positive sanction. The one thing that was positive there was the fact that an Orthodox couple invited us to their home on a Friday night and just shared Shabbat with us, which sort of remained in our memory as an important thing. The imposition of sanctions, I think, always had a negative effect on us. It wasn't people criticizing us for being intermarried. It was people welcoming Rachel and me into their homes for, I don't know, I hope this is okay to say, but one night Yitz and Blue Greenberg invited us to their house for Friday night supper, and we drove there, which is that okay, Blue? Anyway, in strict terms, that's a violation of halacha, because you're not supposed to cause another Jew to to violate halakha. Well, that night was enormously important to us, and the fact that couples like the Greenbergs, who can often fear that welcoming an intermarried couple into their home will encourage their own kids to intermarry, did welcome us into our home and did make us feel part of the community. And then that Rabbi Singer treated Rachel and me as a legitimate kosher couple before Rachel became a Jew by choice. All of that was much more important to me than sanctions. It was all the signs of welcoming and openness in the community. Every time the community would say to me that I was wrong for doing something, that I had to observe this, that I had to observe that, I'm a proud person and I would bridle. So that's really my answer, that Judaism really has to be an invitation and not a set of obligations.
Also, the very idea of sanctions, makes my hair stand quite up on end, and it is already, as you may know, somewhat up on end. The Jewish world has always implied thousands of tiny sanctions and judgments, and one of the things that I would say, and I am saying this from the outside, so you will have to accept it from that point of view, one of the things that I have noticed is the endless judging. This one is not quite as as this one. This one is not doing this exactly right. This one is actually getting into a car at the wrong time. And with all of these constant judgments going on, the community is not really strengthened. In fact, I think it's weakened, because it then begins to distrust its own strength. Its own strength is that these are wonderful traditions. They are powerful. They have meaning. They bring people joy. That way, they're positive. When somebody tells you, you're not as good as the person over there because you did something or other, it tends far more to drive people away. I would think that what the Jewish community needs is fewer sanctions and much more, very importantly, to take the traditions which are certainly built deep into the Jewish ideas of tolerance, of understanding, of giving the other person just that much room, and particularly of accepting pluralism, because we, as the Jewish community, we flourish when the community at large is pluralistic, so we too must accept pluralism.
Two very good answers. I'm afraid that most of the people who impose these sanctions haven't come to the Y tonight.
Well, let me say one other thing about sanctions. I think people imposing sanctions on themselves is quite different than people imposing sanctions. Like, to give an example, which I don't know if it, I don't, well, after I met Rabbi Singer, I spent a lot of time with him, and I finally wrote an article in the Village Voice about him. It was called Orthodox in New York, and a large portion of that time was the days before Passover. And as Passover approached, he became more and more conscious of chametz. I mean, he would just look around, of leavening. He would just look around on tables in a synagogue where he was going to have a seder, and look at each table to see if there was a little crumb of bread there. And at first I thought, gee, what kind of very fussy behavior is this? And then I realized that it was centuries, and it was thousands of years of fussiness that had kept me alive and had kept me a Jew. So watching his fuss, he wasn't telling me to do it, but his fussiness was much more impressive to me than or there was another, I keep using the Greenbergs, but there was another time when Yitz Greenberg walked up a whole lot of stairs at a Saturday afternoon meeting. So watching Yitz do that, again, because he didn't want to violate halakha, was much more important to me than Yitz saying to me, you have to do that. My grandfather drove a large, since my father died, I found out a lot about my grandfather. And one of the ways that he drove a large part of his son and his nephews and nieces away from Judaism was by saying, you dasn't do this, you dasn't do that. So that I have a cousin who remembers sitting on the floor watching television, and my grandfather would come in and say, you dasn't do that. And the reason that she dasn't do it is that it wasn't Tisha B'Av and she wasn't sitting Shiva. Well, she had no understanding of that particular little bit of halakha. And my grandfather certainly didn't live a totally halakhic life or encourage her to understand it. So that was Judaism by fear, and it just didn't work.
Can we just talk about intermarriage for a moment? It's not really intermarriage I want to talk about. It's the fact that I accept absolutely that Paul's marriage was a thing that happened out of love. But very often for many Jewish women, there is a peculiar backlash, and I think, Paul, you did write about this, and I'd like to have you talk about it a little bit more, of the Jewish male's attitude towards the woman, which makes her not such a wonderful sexual object, certainly not an intellectual equal, because she has been removed from the center of the intellectual work of Judaism, and somehow become the joke figure of the Jewish mother, to be avoided at all costs. Now, for the whole community at large talks about the problem of intermarriage. It is important that there be a continuing body of Jewish peoplehood, generation to generation. One of the ways that, one of the things that's important that we discuss is attitudes towards women and how they can be made to be at least as appealing as other women.
Yeah.
I would like, and I'd love to have you talk about Marjorie Morningstar.
Shirley's.
Well, first of all, I sort of want to put it in a slightly, even though I think that that what you're saying is correct. I mean, I agree with what you're saying. I also want to put it in a slightly broader context, because for me it was our attitudes toward Jews' attitudes toward ourselves, and not just toward Jewish women. But the thing that Anne is talking about, when I think actually the up until I was about 15 or 16, I dated exclusively Jewish girls or young women. What do you call somebody who's 15? Can you say, I don't know. Anyway.
Look, Paul, I mean...
Then I got to be 15. Well, Adine Steinshaus, who's going to speak here next week, was telling us that the perfect age to read Freud was at 10, so I don't know. Now I've sort of lost my sense of age. Anyway, when I was 15, and the reason that that's a good age to read Freud is because you haven't reached puberty yet, so you could have a pure intellectual enjoyment of Freud instead of having
emotional entanglement.
Right. So. Okay, so when I was 15 or 16, two things happened to me, and I think that they're both relevant to the question to intermarriage. One was I encountered this fierce barrage of anti-Semitism at Choate, which decreased my own self-esteem as a Jew, and I also began to read a lot of Jewish literature, in which, or a lot of literature in which Jews were negative figures. One of them, which didn't involve women, was The Sun Also Rises, where Robert Cowen, do people know who he is? Well, in The Sun Also Rises, he's a boxer who can't fight, who doesn't ever fight, who gets bored at a bullfight, and who's sort of a figure of fun for Jake Barnes and Bill Gorton and all the characters who you really like in the book. So as a Jewish man, Robert Cowen was just a person I didn't want to be. Or, I don't know, if people here read Norman Mailer's short work of fiction called Time of Her Time. Well, it's a story about a Catholic bullfighter who is able to help a Jewish NYU student achieve her first orgasm.
How?
Read the story. Or organize either read the story or organize a different panel, but I don't know that.
In my mind, it's the movie, which now takes...
Marjorie Morningstar.
Okay, I'm going to go to Marjorie Morningstar, but there's an off-stage character in that named Arthur, who is passive and who cannot make the same woman who achieve a climax, and who's a Jewish man. And so that also gave me a fear of being a certain fear of myself as a Jewish man. Well, in Marjorie Morningstar, there's a generic... Have people here read it?
Some have.
Okay.
Why does he ask these silly questions? Some have and some haven't.
There's a generic figure named Shirley, who is a Jewish woman who's always sort of hanging around on the edges of Bohemia, and she's always sort of going with an artist or an actor. It seems more to defy her mother or her father than because she's actually going to become an artist or an actress herself. And Noel Ehrman, who's the very attractive protagonist of the novel, makes Shirley into a figure of fun. Shirley is a man-trapper. In the end of the book, Marjorie Morningstar has changed her name back to what it was, Marjorie Morningstern, and she lives in a suburb of New York and has a kosher home. So you think of Shirley's as generic Jewish women who are going to put you as a generic Jewish man in a prison of... in a prison of kashrut and Sabbath observance and all these things, and also make you less free to travel in the world. So it's not only that they're not thinkers, but in this kind of fiction, they're really grasping and out to get you. And here you have this idea of yourself. I had this idea of myself based on these books as being in danger of becoming an Arthur. So and also because of the anti-Semitism that I encountered at Choate and in the world, I really wanted to find some sort of a passport to America, and that was another impetus not to marry a Jewish woman, because in my mind, marrying a non-Jewish woman was a way of getting closer to America. And I think that that's true in the case of probably a lot of Jewish men and Jewish women. Well, I think Anne's right that there has got to be much more positive stereotypes of Jewish women, but positive attitudes toward Jewish women. But what am I saying?
That's what happens when you read Freud after 10.
Or anyway, there has to be more positive attitudes toward Jewish women. But I think that the broader context is that there has to be a much more positive attitude toward Judaism, period. Because then a kosher home won't seem like a prison, and Marjorie Morningstar's desire to change her name to Morgan Stern won't seem like a reactionary act, but will seem like an act of some quality. And I think when Herman Wouk wrote that book, he wrote me a letter about my book, my rendering of his book, and he says that he perceived Marjorie Morning Stern as a positive figure, whereas I, as a reader, perceive. I mean, but he didn't portray her as a positive figure. So that there has to be some way of portraying people who are Jewish women and Jewish life as something that's attractive rather than something that's imprisoning.
Well, the nice thing is that we're not in the 40s or the 50s when those books were written, even the 60s. Somehow we're at this wonderful moment now where all of those images of Jewish male, of Jewish female, they can be done again. They can be reshaped, and that seems to me to be the exciting
Thanks for
task of
listening.
the moment.
For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New
Before
York,
we open
and
up
all of our
questions,
programs,
to
please visit us
you
at
crowded into the
92ny.org.
Perhaps Paul and Anne have one or two more things they'd like to ask of each other.
Well, I covered my Marjorie Morningstar question already, which was my big question, and that's what I wanted him to talk about.
Is there anything you have?
Yeah, did I answer it adequately?
Yes.
Well, no, Anne, actually, it gets to a question that you and I were discussing on the phone. If, I'm afraid this is going to take us off on a byway, but if the way that I learned about, because of my background, a large part of the way that I learned about Jewish life was through literature. And as I say, these negative images cropped up when I read the books that I talked about before. One of the most explosive forces in my consciousness was reading The Chosen, where Chaim Potok had a totally positive portrayal of Orthodox Jewish life. And I remember just sitting on a subway, seeing Danny and Reuven play in that baseball game, and then watching Reuven's, not Danny's, but Reuven's relationship with his father. His father was involved in textual criticism of the Talmud, and Reuven was doing a lot of the work for him. And I just saw that relationship as one that I would have liked to have had with my father. Now, okay, that's a fact that Potok had a positive portrayal of Jewish life, and these other people had negative portrayals of Jewish life. It's also a fact that Philip Roth is one of the people who's made a joke out of a Jewish mother, and yet you and I both agree that writers, or I don't know, do you think that writers have some kind of a debt to the Jewish world to create the sort of models that we're talking about?
They have a debt to the Jewish world to portray it accurately, and if those models are real, and that's what they want to portray, then that's what they will portray. But we are not living then anymore. That's no longer necessary. And I remember being 17 years old when you are not a woman, but you think you are, and thinking to myself, an Israeli soldier is going to come and find me and take me away to Israel. And I would fantasy about this Israeli soldier and about the life that we would lead. The thing that puzzles me now is, why didn't I think of going and finding the Israeli soldier? Now, The fact is that in the culture that I came from, that would have been an amazing act of genius that I wasn't capable of. It really would have been extraordinary. To become active instead of passive was unthinkable. Now, this is completely changed. Now I could go and find the soldier, and the generations to come will do that. So this is why I feel it's all changed.
Yeah.
We're open now for a few questions from the floor. There are 2 microphones. I'd like to first...
Are the house lights going up or am I asking?
No, the house lights.
3 biblical... Hello.
Yeah.
You mentioned 3 biblical incidents when you opened your little talk, and it seemed to disturb your feminist belief system. Would it help any to know that Isaac was never sacrificed, that the Lot incident was initiated by the women, and Leah was a very, very willing partner to the deceit that was practiced in men?
I didn't hear the last part.
I said that Leah
Yeah,
was a very willing partner in the deceit that was practiced on the wedding night.
We could talk about this forever, but the very fact that Isaac thought he might be sacrificed, that Abraham went through the emotional terror of having to make such a decision, seems to me to be a terrible, terrible injustice. When I think of how I would feel if I thought I would have to kill one of my own children, it is overwhelming. That's not a feminist issue. That's just a general complaint. Second of all, the question of Leah, it was said of her, perhaps, that she went along willingly, but with a little imagination and a little empathy, we can feel how sad it was that she even had to pretend to go along with it. I mean, the wonderful thing about all this material is that we can make it rich again in each generation by applying our own particular lenses to it. It's not serious in the sense that we're not talking about an absolute truth. We're talking about what we can get out of it by turning our modern eye on it and turning it around in different ways.
It's true, we could go on all night. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Bonnie?
Hi, I'm Bonnie Steinberg, and I want to thank you for talking about the image of Jewish women. The question that I have has to do with the socialization of Jewish men and Jewish women, and I like to look at siblings, brothers and sisters. And I seem to remember from one of your books that there were, in your parents' generations, your fathers and their brothers were socialized very differently from their sisters. And some of that had to do with Jewish, keeping one Jewish and making the other more emancipated or whatever, and I'd like it if you would describe that more if it's relevant.
It may have differed in our families. Do you want to talk about it?
I'm sure it's different in both of our families. Yeah. Do you want to answer it?
Sure, but I don't know if Liza wants to add to this. In our family, my brother and I were both, that wasn't really an issue. My brother and I were both urged to go to a boarding school away from home, and my parents didn't make any issue of the fact that we would marry non-Jewish women. It just didn't exist as an issue. My sisters, particularly, I think Liza, particularly Holly, was obliged to stay at home. She wasn't. We would go to Martha's Vineyard during the summer, and she wasn't allowed to stay on Martha's Vineyard. She had to be in a much more protected area of summer camp. And she says anyway that my parents used to say to her that she should marry a Jewish man. My father, I think, expected Jeff and me to succeed in the world, and that was one of the reasons that we went to this boarding school, so that we could get corporate boardroom manners. And it didn't matter to him as much if the girls in our family succeeded in the world. So there was a Jewish standard, and a Jewish standard, a double standard. And I think that and it may have been a Jewish standard at the time, but the reason that I had Jewish in my mind was that it caused my sister Holly to become much more aware of Judaism at a much earlier age than I was, to have a much greater appetite to become an observant Jew at an earlier age than me. And I think that was one offshoot of this double standard.
Do you want me to answer this? Well, my brother is a very remarkable person. He's a linguist who knows almost as many languages as they spoke on the Tower of Babel. He rebelled against the emptiness of the family culture by becoming more Jewish after his bar mitzvah. He learned Yiddish fluently, which was unheard of in my family. He learned Hebrew. He went towards the Jewish culture earlier, but remember, it had great rewards for a male at that time. It offered him an escape that was not available to me because I was shut out of the learning.
So it was really totally, so as far as being Jewish is concerned, there was a double standard in both families.
Well, it wasn't the standard in the families that was different, it's the standard in the world that was different.
Yeah.
Yes?
My name is Diane Azer. I'd like to query Ms. Roiphe on a piece of terminology that she used. I'm a product of an intermarriage myself, Sephardic and Ashkenazi. I didn't mean to be funny. I didn't know that was funny. And I don't understand what the phrase "the Jewish nation" means. I see it as non-existent. You used that phrase earlier.
Yes, I love that phrase.
What does it mean?
I will explain what I mean. I mean all of us, Sephardic, Ashkenazi, Hasidic, secular, Zionists, socialists, anarchists, rebels of all kinds, anybody who is willing to stand up and say, us. If we take the wicked child's question at the Seder, what does this mean to me? It happened to you a long time ago. Anybody who says us is a part of this body of people that in some way is moving towards a communal purpose, as long as you don't disavow the connection.
What connection? Well, I don't want to get...
What connection?
Yeah. What connection?
Can I follow that question?
Paul, do you want to?
No, actually, I thought there's a question that you're not asking that you might as well. There's a thing you're not saying that you might as well say.
Yeah.
What is the problem that you feel is not being addressed?
I simply don't see any of that as being particularly Jewish. I mean, what is the Jewish content of it that would bind together all different types of Jews?
Well, now,
as long as they identify themselves as Jewish. Look, think of it this way. There's a molecule, or an atom, I can never remember which is the bigger one. It has all of these tiny, tiny pieces. And there's some kind of an electric magnetic field that holds the whole body together. Every part of it does not have to be the same. It is not a unity of identical parts, but it is nevertheless a unity. If you split it, you get a great big bang. What I feel is that this molecule here forms something that we can call a Jewish nation, a Jewish body politic, a Jewish experience. Some people will have it in a more profound, have more Jewish content in it than others, but they will still all belong. I was in my pediatrician's office, and a young Hasidic woman had her baby on her lap, and when my daughter and I smiled at that baby, the woman turned her back to us and put the baby facing the wall so the baby could no longer smile at my daughter. It was a peculiar, insulting experience. What I really thought was, wait a minute, because you turn your back on me, I don't disappear. I'm still here and I'm still Jewish and we are still in a relationship with each other, whether or not you acknowledge it. And that's what I mean by the Jewish nation.
That's a very good answer.
My name is Jean Hershaft. I'm the associate editor of the Jewish Post of New York, a 50-year-old Anglo-Jewish publication. And my question is first addressed to Paul Cowen. There are two. You say that you are now an observant Jew. Most observant Jews in this country today equate dissent with Israel's policy or Israel's heroes as tantamount to being a traitor. The question is, how do you view it? And then, Ms. Roiphe, how do you view it? Now, question number 2. In this week's Jewish Week, which is our competitor, there was a blistering letter attacking you by a woman who is not sure that you wrote an article, but believes you did, in the Village Voice in August, which was critical of Israel and the Lebanese invasion. And my question to you, did you write that piece, or why didn't you at least have an answer in the week, there was no answer at all from you, giving the implication that you did?
Wait, I didn't hear the end of what you said.
I said, no, the question is, did you write the piece, or if in either, if you did or didn't, why wasn't there an answer, a reply to this woman's blistering attack?
It was a man.
Or a man, whoever it was.
They never called me up. I didn't write the piece. There's an answer in next week's Jewish Week, and the editor retracts it. But the tone of voice of your question, and actually the tone of voice all right, that letter taught me two different things. One is it reinforced a feeling I have as a journalist anyway, and a feeling that I developed when I saw my father being pilloried by false information. That letter writers, editors, and journalists have an enormous responsibility to remember that there's a human being at the other end of their sentence, and that the author of that letter should have at least checked. I think the article he's referring to wasn't even published in August. I think it was published in the same issue that I published a piece about the Falkland Islands, and I think he must have transposed my name with the author of the other article. That's what I think has to have happened. I don't know why he didn't call me, or the editor of the paper didn't call me, and I think it's a more general thing about journalists. But I also know the article. I think I know what article that he's referring to, and I think it was a perfectly healthy article for somebody to have written. My own personal feelings about journalism in particularly is I don't like to write about things that I haven't seen, and I would have to live in Israel for a period of time before I could really assess it. I wouldn't want to add my own voice to the sort of clamor of ill-informed, dove and hawkish opinion that exists in America right now. Having said that, though, I also think that it's very important that we don't make Israel our synagogue and criticize anybody who criticizes Israel and read them out of the community and think that Jacobo Timmerman is no longer a Jew because he wrote his book, or Anthony Lewis is less of a Jew than someone else because he writes his articles. I think that it's tremendously important to have this kind of ferment exist here. And I was hoping that the question of the woman who asked before would be specifically about Sephardic Jews, because I think one item in this whole discussion of Israel that's never talked about by most people in America is, first of all, the fact that Sephardic Jews are in the majority in Israel, and second of all, that soon Israel's going to have not a president or a prime minister like Navon, but somebody like David Levy, who doesn't speak English, who lives in a settlement town, who's got 8 kids, who lives a whole different way than most people's images of the way that Israelis are. So I think we have to get very much accustomed to that, and I think that's got to be, that which is kind of an internal dissent about Israel, has to play a much bigger role in our thinking about Israel.
Ms. Roiphe?
The angel who didn't stop me from writing the letter is about to not stop me again. It seems to me that the responsibility, the obligation of each of us, if we care about Israel or we care about anything deeply, is to be active, to be open, to be truthful about what we feel. Now, the politics are very complicated, and I don't understand them completely. What I do feel is that there has to be some greater flexibility and some less militaristic posturing. I'm frightened of the militaristic posturing. Now, I can say that here without affecting any policy. I mean, I am, nobody's listening to me. From my ears, it doesn't go directly anywhere. What I do feel is important is that everybody feel free to speak out and say what they feel. The whole range of opinion, from the most conservative to the most liberal, and only that way will we be able to truly be a real friend of Israel, to be really a part of Israel.
Thank you.
Let me just mention that next week, while our subject is not necessarily Israeli politics, it's rather Jews as, it says actually it's a misprint. It's not Jews as mega family, but Jews as meta family. Which
most people, I don't know what is it.
There's a big difference, so you'll find out next week. Yeah. In any case, Adin Steinsaltz is not simply a Talmudic scholar or a Kabbalist, which he is both, and also a physicist, mathematician, but also a particularly interesting commentator on Israeli society. Stephen P. Cohen is a social psychologist who specializes in conflict resolution, and the conflict which he's most engaged in right now is the Israeli-Arab dispute. Both of them hold very different political views, and while that's not necessarily the subject of our discussion next week, certainly in terms of the open-ended question and answer period we can have following their dialogue, which may also include some Israel issues, you're perfectly free to raise those issues next week too. Yes?
Back here, there's a question.
Okay, I'm sorry. We've been ignoring all these people in the back.
Thank you. I know I'm short, but not that.
We're ignoring short people in the back.
Right. My name is Sally Krause, and I enjoyed Mr. Cowen's book.
Can you talk a little bit louder, please?
Yeah, I enjoyed Mr. Cowen's book. It's the only one I've read so far of the two of you. I guess there's another term that has to be defined here tonight besides the tribe, what it means to be a Jewish tribe, but what is a secular Jew? Both of you have used that term, and I don't know what it means. And secondly, the image of the wicked son that we talk about at Pesach has come up, and that came to mind as Ms. Brophy was talking, and she talks about Judaism implying thousands of sanctions and judgments, and if she feels that way, and talks about you observing and you saying words, then what does Judaism mean to you then? I don't understand what your theology is about. I see both of you as analyzing yourselves and your families. I think Mr. Cowen's book is an attempt at self-analysis without lying on the couch. But what does religion mean to you if you keep talking about you observing and you saying the words?
Well, I hope, before I answer that question, I hope that everybody here understands that when Paul Cowen talks about his family experiences, he is not analyzing himself for the pleasure of some kind of, self-improvement. It's not that kind of activity at all. What it is a sharing of the most painful and intimate experiences so that they can be of use to the community at large. They are not, it is not an indulgence, it's a gift that we all receive.
So what are you trying to say to
now let's get back to the secular Jew question. Somebody just said to me tonight, that's a bad word. You shouldn't say it. That's like saying, it's like you calling somebody Negro instead of black, or it's just bad. Actually, to me, what it means is very simply this, that at this particular moment, matters of faith and observance are difficult. Maybe they won't be in 10 years, maybe they won't always be, but right now, I can't do that. But what I can do is fill my mind with Jewish content, with as much Jewish learning as can still get into it. I can enrich myself and enrich the imagery that I have to work with. And in doing so, in making myself a part of the history through knowledge, which after all, if you know something, you belong to it to some degree. If I do that, then I have made a connection that I consider Jewish, secular Jewish. I'm not ashamed of that term. I'm not afraid of that term. I don't wish it on anybody else.
I have a somewhat different answer. I would never use the term secular Jew pejoratively. I just don't think that it should be used that way. I think there are other terms perhaps to describe what you're talking about, but there is a great tradition of secular Judaism. It usually came out of communities where there was a greater degree of Jewish knowledge than the kind that you and I had as children. But there is a very great, and you were talking about some of it, anarchists, communists, socialists. Shalom Aleichem is part of that tradition. So the Shilla schools that existed are part of it. Camps like Kinderland are part of it. It really is a great part of our collective heritage.
If you think for a minute of the baby sitting on the mother's lap, the baby has two desires two contradictory desires. One is to mold into the mother, to fold against her, and the other is to put her little feet in the lap and stand up as straight as she possibly can and push away and look around. Both of those impulses are seen in a Jewish tradition, in Jewish culture. We would not have Freud or Marx or Einstein or any of the people and their works that the Jewish community takes great pride in if there wasn't this constant tension between the pulling away and the coming towards. Since Hellenic times, since the Golden Calf, it has always been a kind of central conflict and a creative conflict in the Jewish tradition.
And we can go on about this for a while, but I have to say that my mother's legacy to me, which I call a kind of secular messianism, which meant work in the civil rights movement, work in the, which is based on the prophetic text, I feel is valuable a part of my personality as anything else. And in fact, I meant to say this when Steve asked about trade-offs. I feel this interplay constantly between my mother's universalism and the particularism that I associate with my father. And I think that one of the things that's going to happen as we sort of retribalize is that there's going to be a whole new development in American politics. I think a lot of people are retribalizing. I don't think it's just Jews. I think it's happening with Italians, it's certainly happening with blacks. It's also happening on other tribal levels. And I think that the result of that, just as in the 30s, politics was sort of based on a celebration of America as a melting pot, and the ethnic part of a person's personality was subordinate to their Americanness. I think what's going to happen in the 80s is a celebration of diversity and the ability to be proud of who we are and to revel in who the other one is. So I think that and I think I feel that way because inside of myself, as I become more deeply involved in the Jewish community, I still retain this secularism, this universalism of my mother's, and I don't want to be separated from other people at all.
Yes?
I'm Olga Barakat. The thing that worries me a little bit is in hearing both your stories is the amount of emotional attachment to the various people who have either by contrast or by emulation caused you to be interested or involved in Judaism. I'm sorry, I'll take a minute extra. But I remember a long time ago a lecture on various Eastern religions given by a professor from Columbia who said, well, after examining various religions, if he had his druthers, he would rather be a Buddhist. What I would like to ask you is, what in the content of Judaism do you admire, apart from Rabbi Singer and apart from grandparents and wanting to belong and wanting to claim one's heritage? I mean, suppose in a college campus, there are kids who say, well, I've looked at various things. What would you say is so valuable and wonderful about inherently in the construct of Judaism that is worth keeping and not giving away?
Good question.
I have a feeling this is an answer that will come out piecemeal as each of us. First of all, I don't think that it's possible to. I mean, I think that the emotional attachments that we have to individual people are at least, I think in Anne's case and in my case, are very positive because those people provide examples of ways to live. Okay, now what are the contents? What is there in the contents of Judaism? In the first of these talks, I think Yitz Greenberg expressed the idea of chosenness in the way that I would like to express it. I think it's a very important thing not to think of ourselves as exclusively chosen people, but certainly as people who are beacons for other people, both in the way that we practice and in the way that we live. That is, at least that's part of the way that I was raised, and I'm very glad that I was raised that way. I was raised to think that I had a responsibility as a Jew to work alongside people who were undergoing all sorts of difficulties. I'm very glad that I was raised that way. Okay, that's one thing. Second thing is there's a tremendous amount in the study of Jewish texts that most people don't really have much of an opportunity to, many Jews don't have much of an opportunity to learn, but, or to involve themselves in. Here you can do it, say, at the community study sessions before Rosh Hashanah, but studying a portion of the Torah before that week's, before you go to synagogue that week, taking a course with somebody, really delving into the kinds of questions that person asked Anne about Lod, that Mr. Katz asked Anne about Lod and Leah. It's a wonderfully exciting intellectual challenge. And one of the things about the Baalei Tshuva yeshiva, the yeshivas for Jews who've become newly religious, when you talk to them, often they're products of very good colleges. They've had very promising careers as lawyers or doctors or newspaper people, whatever, and they have found more pure excitement in the process of Jewish study than anything else. The third thing is ceremony, just the fact that one can, I mean, Christians can do this too, I just don't happen to be a Christian, but the fact that one can enrich one's life with so much ceremony, from Shabbat to the cycle of holidays, to thinking, to blessing food because it's really a gift, to thanking God that you wake up every morning, that the more seriously you take Judaism and the more seriously you take the idea of God, and the more seriously you take the idea that life and each incident in life is a blessing, then the more seriously you take the whole idea of life itself. And I think that is something that's given to us.
I just want to add to that you all know this story about Rabbi Hillel, who the student comes to and says, teach me everything, and he says, all you need to know is, do unto others, be good to people, I can teach you that standing on one foot, that's it. I don't like that story. I really want to know all the details. I don't think the simplification is really quite enough, and the details are both, it's the material that's in the Torah, it's the material that's in the Talmud, of which I know very little right now. It's also Jewish history, which I know a great deal more about. It's the Hasidic tale, which I know something about. It's the whole conglomerate of the cultural experience which we can call Jewish, which one can spend many, many lifetimes knowing. And that's what I feel the connection is, not to particular people.
I'd like to exercise my role as moderator to do the following. There are 5 people standing up right now for questions. That's it. But I'd like to do it in the following way. I'd like all of them to ask their questions one after the other, and then we'll see what themes emerge. Paul and Anne can choose to answer those aspects of the questions which are most meaningful for them. So Mark and Irving Bernstein.
My name is Mark Hurwitz. Both of you come from the fringes and have spoken a great deal about being from the fringes and on the fringes of Jewish identification. Do you believe that any group, and specifically the Jewish group, has the right or perhaps the obligation to define the limits of acceptable behavior on the part of someone in order to remain within the body of the group?
Irving Bernstein.
Yes, Irving Bernstein. It is said that art imitates life, and therefore we had the Robert Cohens and What Makes Sammy Run. Do you think that your 2 journeys, back to faith and tradition, are an aberration, or do you think they represent and reflect a change in society and in life among writers of your generation?
Shirley Unger, I'd like to ask both of you to expand upon a topic that you touched, and that is the Orthodox Jew who was raised with a very negative attitude, with the judgment, the repression, the anger, and almost a hatred of it, so that the Orthodox Jew then leaves Judaism but finds oneself in the untenable position of not being able to live with it and then not being able to live without it.
My name is Mark Vershbo, Mordechai Ben Shmuel. I am personally on the same odyssey as you two have undertaken, and toward being what I call a born-again Jew. And I have found, and I'm very much at the same stage, I think, as Ms. Roiphe, I have found personally the works of Abraham Joshua Heschel, his mentor Martin Buber, and one of his disciples, Rabbi Samuel Dresner, to be particularly inspiring and to provide guidance in this journey. And much of what the two of you have spoken of sounds very much in the Abraham Joshua Heschel's theology of return, as he called it, wherein he provides a ladder of observance whereupon a Jew at any stage can step up and step at his own pace. And I wondered in the first place whether you had encountered these guideposts yourselves, and if so, might elaborate upon what they meant for you, and otherwise to inform the audience, many of whom are inquiring for such guidance, that there exist these men and large bodies of their preachings and of their books. Thank you.
David Zoni. My question's on this thorny issue of sanctions, and it's to Anne Roiphe. And I felt you may have somewhat misinterpreted the word sanctions, which you equated with judgments, and judgments in terms seem to be equated with being judgmental. And it seems to me that there may be a different tradition of sanctions, where sanctions might be equated with obligations, with commitment, with faith, both to God and to community, to Jewish history. Sanctions then are a kind of center of gravity of the Jewish tradition. And one can argue, I think, that a large part of American Jewish life is a reflection of the lack of sanctions. Thus, both the resurgence of orthodoxy, which shows a hunger for a complete system of sanctions, and the pro-Israelism, Judaism equals pro-Israelism, and conversely, the lack of affiliation, assimilation, and so on. So my question is, don't we need sanctions? It's similar to Mark Hurwitz's question. Don't we need sanctions, very definite do's and don'ts, the type of thing that used to be suggested by the word halacha, besides the vague liberal Western notions of tolerance, understanding, and pluralism?
Some very good questions. Paul?
Okay, I don't feel quite satisfied with our answer to the question that you asked before about what there is in Judaism. So I want to just go back to that for a second, because maybe it'll express also sort of an answer to that second question about whether our journeys are aberration. Mr. Bernstein's question about whether our journeys are reflections of the time or aberrations. I'll tell you, one of the things that I was looking for most, particularly as the New Left began to dissolve, and as my family scattered and after my parents died, was a community, an imperishable community that would replace the political community that I had known, which would replace my family as a community. And there were all sorts of constructs in the 60s that tried to do that, like communes and political movements and stuff like that. Well, I began to see the Jewish world on the Upper West Side as a community that really was an extended family. When my parents died, the people who best knew how to deal with my grief were a nun whom I had known from the Catholic left, a black person who grew up in a very religious black town in the South, and a lot of Jews on the Upper West Side of New York who taught us how to sit Shiva and really helped us learn how to mourn. When I began to live in the world of the Lower East Side, in Rabbi Singer's world, it was just a wonder to me how much people knew about each other, and how there was always a bris happening or some kind of celebration happening. Now I know that there's a negative side to that, which is that everybody knows everybody else's business, but the positive side to it really did seem to me this kind of community strength, and I wanted that very much for myself. So Mr. Bernstein, I think that in that respect, I don't know if I can talk for Anne, but I don't think I am an aberration at all. I think that a lot of Jews in my generation and people who are younger than me, and a lot of non-Jews in my generation, people who are younger than me, feel this sense of loneliness. Parents have died, families have scattered. The promise of America is frayed. And the thing that becomes important is to construct a community. And the thing that, and I think that one of the easiest things to construct a community around is some blend of who you were in Europe and who you are in America. And then you also that makes you part of a greater community. So I think that is simply the case, and that I think the response to both of our books illustrates the fact that a lot of people are very hungry for this. People led us, so they're very hungry to do this kind of thing and to read about it.
I just wanted to add that if we look at the statistics, 42% of all children, never mind Jewish children, but of all children in America are going to be brought up in single homes. What is it? We're almost at the 50% at the divorce rate. We're living, 1 out of 10 people is alcoholic, 1 out of 10 is going to be in a mental hospital. We're living in a culture out there which just doesn't work. Now, there are going to be many, many different solutions, but what we are going to start to see is the Jewish solution, the community, the family, the traditions. The other thing that I wanted to point out is not very romantic, but it's true, and that is class. We now have we have gone through the bourgeois experience. We have gone through the time where Jews made money and they joined country clubs, and they have that experience where the culture was very shallow. It wasn't really American, it wasn't really Jewish, it wasn't really anything. That generation is almost finished, and their children are standing around looking for something else. And they don't have to fight the same taboos, they don't have to fight the same anti-Semitism. They already have money, so they don't have to spend their whole lives making it in quite the same way. They may have to make it, but they now have a better education to get it. In a sense, the culture has moved, which means that there will be more and more Jews looking for Jewish homes.
Both of you now, Anne and Paul, have an opportunity next 5 minutes simply to sum up in any way you want, any loose ends, any of the questions that have now reoccurred to you and so forth. This is your last opportunity, at least this evening, to share with you those things which you've wanted to this evening.
Well, I don't want to feel like it's 2 minutes to go in the Super Bowl.
But it is.
No, we got a lot of access to print. I want to I just want to answer or say my response to some of the other questions and say something that what Ann said brought up in my mind. I think that aside from the end of the bourgeois dream or whatever it is, the ideal of that, well, I want to put it more positively. About 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, we don't have a rabbi in our synagogue, and so I was sitting on a train going from Baltimore to Philadelphia, reading the Torah so that I could prepare the explication of the Torah for that week. And I was wearing a yarmulke as I was reading the Torah, and I noticed that nobody on the train was looking at me. And I began to think of whether or not my father even could have done that, could have worn a yarmulke. And I realized that in the 1940s and 1950s, he simply couldn't have. So that his assimilation, which is another word I don't like to use pejoratively, paved the way for my ability to explore Judaism. And I think that's another reason, Mr. Bernstein, that so many people have an opportunity to come back. I think another thing that's happened stems from something that Ann talks about. A lot of us really have begun to feel that there is a limit to what reason can do, what rationality can do. And in fact, we've seen how in some cases rationality and its counterpart science can become nightmarish. I mean, we think about bombs, we think about 3 Mile Island. There just is a limit. And when there's a limit to reason, it means that there's something to mysticism, there's something to faith, there's something more than we had thought about, something to things that we would have thought off limits maybe 10 or 15 years ago. I'm sure that those limits are causing a lot of young people to go into cults. I mean, I think that the existence or the growing existence of cults is one expression of their experience that reason has its limits. I also think that since Judaism actually is a much more attractive religion than any cult is attractive, Judaism can begin to draw people who are looking for something mysterious in their lives, who realize that there are ineffable forces in the universe, and provide us with the kinds of experiences that answer our yearnings. And I think that those experiences, the limits the limits to reason that we're beginning to think about, and the reason and the yearning for something transcendent and imperishable that all of us feel, are seeds for the future. They're seeds that will create more Jews. And with those seeds around, you don't need sanctions. Sanctions, I really believe, drive people away. And it's seeds and making a world more attractive that brings people home. So that's really where I want to end.
Anne?
Well, the only thing that I would want to add is that if you define sanctions as obligations, that seems to me crucial, sensible, a basic pillar of the Jewish community. If a sanction is something you apply to someone else, it becomes a negative. And that's all I was talking about was the judging of someone else, not the judging of yourself or the demands you make on yourself. And I think those are two different things. Basically, I think I have said everything I have to say tonight.
Before I thank both you, the audience, you've really been wonderful. It's been a wonderful audience and also a wonderful evening because of the dialogue between these two speakers. I'd like to tell you a story, or share with you a story. It's hard to do when everyone is standing up and leaving. Misses the drama that I prepared all evening. I mean, you know, here's a program built around these two people, and really here's this egocentric moderator wanting to tell the story.
But see, the drama of our leaving is we're going to carry Steve off stage on our shoulders.
The problem is that the story is a very serious story, and now you're all laughing. It's not exactly a Hasidic story, and it's probably one that none of you have heard. I really don't remember where I first encountered it. I think it was told by Margaret Mead or Ruth Benedict, the anthropologist. But in a certain sense, many of us become Jews through anthropology in a way. I did, as a kind of participant observer in a Hasidic, with a Hasidic family. And the story is something about Ruth Benedict or Margaret Mead, knowing an anthropologist who comes upon an American Indian, this must have been about 40 years ago or so, who is kneeling by a river and crying. And the anthropologist, as anthropologists are wont to do, it's their business, asks the Indian, why is he crying? And he says that in the beginning, the Great Spirit allotted to each of the various Indian tribes its own gourd, its own cup, which it could use to take the water from the river of life that the Great Spirit had provided, and to drink from that water which represents the Spirit of life. But the Indians said that when the white man came, all the gourds, all the cups were shattered. He said, I'm crying because my cup, my gourd has been shattered, and I don't know how to put the pieces back together again. What I have learned tonight is that there are possibilities of putting the pieces back together, that all of us have gourds, all of us have special cups, which are very special and very, very precious. And there are ways of finding a glue which will put that gourd back together again. It will never be the same as the gourd that our great-grandfathers or great-grandmothers had in their closets or on their tables they used every day. But it will be our special gourds, the ones that we will use to dip into the river of life and to get that wisdom which will make us into the authentic human beings that we talked about. Thank you again, and there's a reception in the room adjoining.
Wonderful.